Thank you for joining us for this look at the best original reporting from KPBS News this week. I'm Amitha Sharma. Coming up, the life of an asylum seeker waiting for answers. As Ukrainians are allowed into the U.S., Gustavo Solis talks with women from one of Mexico's most dangerous regions, hoping they'll get the same treatment. Let's talk about it. Christina Kim updates her series on how uncomfortable conversations about race and politics can help us better understand one another. And MG Perez takes us inside a classroom using the music of Selena as a bridge to Latino culture. This week, San Diego police released video of the latest shooting involving its officers. It happened during an overnight incident in Tierra Santa last Saturday. The department says it responded to calls of several home break-ins. At one point, the intruder took a woman hostage, and that's when an officer climbed onto a roof next door and fired shots into the home. The man was not struck and later surrendered. That incident involved San Diego police. Across the county, changes are coming to the way these shootings are investigated. But as John Carroll reports, major oversight groups say that comes as a surprise to them.
Until now, when a sheriff's deputy or a police officer shot and killed someone while on the job, the department that person worked for did the shooting investigation. No more. Now, the San Diego Police Department will do the investigation for deputy-involved shootings. The opposite is true if a San Diego officer is involved in a deadly shooting. All other officer-involved shootings will be handled by the Sheriff's Department. And if both the Sheriff's Department and SDPD are involved in a deadly shooting, Chula Vista Police will conduct the investigation.
The way I found out was I was driving home and I was listening to KPBS.
We learned today that neither the CLRB, the Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board, which oversees deadly shootings involving sheriff's deputies, or its counterpart, the CPP, the Commission on Police Practices, which does the same thing with San Diego police shootings, were notified of the new protocol. CPP Chairman Brandon Hilpert says he was shocked. He had no idea the change was coming.
And we have usually quarterly meetings with the chief of police and his staff. And not once have they even given us a heads up that this was coming.
And Yusef Miller with the North County Equity and Justice Coalition told KPBS Midday Edition that the change doesn't go nearly far enough.
We need non-law enforcement affiliated organizations to investigate law enforcement. We anticipate the same results if law enforcement, no matter sheriff or police department, when they investigate themselves.
Under Sheriff Kelly Martinez says the move is meant to increase transparency and to build trust with the public. And she rejects the view of Miller and others that police agencies should not be investigating other police agencies. She says the departments are all independent and that no department will have influence over another when it comes to investigations. As for the lack of notification of either the CLRB or the CPP, we contacted both the Sheriff's Department and San Diego PD for a response. The Sheriff's Department sent us an email saying in part that the recent MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between law enforcement agencies is completely separate from the MOU between sheriffs and CLRB. We didn't get a reply from the San Diego Police Department.
We're not happy with the fact that they chose to sideline the Commission on Police Practices and keep us out of the loop on this.
Hilpert says he's hoping to meet with Chief David Nislight to figure out how the change will impact their investigations because, he says now, they just don't have any details. John Carroll, KPBS News.
Oceanside is North County's largest city, but it doesn't have a single homeless shelter. A contract is in place to open one, but work is being held up. KPBS North County reporter Tanya Thorne explains why.
Donnie D lets us inside the future site of Oceanside's first homeless shelter.
Not much has changed since we signed a service agreement, and I think that's unfortunate, but patience is a virtue, right? I mean, patience is the key, and I think it's been hard. But
he is the president of the San Diego Rescue Mission, the organization selected to run the shelter. It will be located at the old Ocean Shores High School off Oceanside Boulevard and El Camino Real. But the buildings are in need of a remodel, and a shovel has yet to hit the ground to prepare for the 50-bed homeless shelter.
Since November, it's just been submitting plans and trying to get permits and ready to go. I think our contractor had to get a license. The that was acceptable.
The site is city-owned, and working with a government agency is new territory for the rescue mission.
We typically own our own stuff and we set our own timelines, but in working with another municipality and working with another city, you know, we've had to jump through some hoops just to try to figure this out, and I think that's delayed it a little bit.
Dee says he hoped to be open by now, but the city required 3 different bids for all work before one was approved. In a statement, the city of Oceanside said that when developing a project of this magnitude, it is normal and expected for plans to change. But Dee says work on the shelter is about to start.
We're ready to start demolition, and that will happen next week. That'll take a couple of weeks to get everything cleaned out, and then they will start to renovate this property.
The rescue mission is responsible for funding operations of the shelter, while the city is responsible for the remodel of the buildings. And over $2 million in federal funding was recently secured, dedicated to the remodel of the homeless shelter.
It's my understanding that that's what they will use to renovate this facility, which is about a $2 million budget. And then I think it's another $300,000 or $400,000 to furnish it.
While the 50-bed shelter won't solve homelessness in Oceanside, Dee says he hopes the shelter will fill up in order to need an expansion.
I hope that I have to go to my board and to the city and say, look, we don't have enough beds. We're getting people off the streets in a remarkable way. We need more beds. That would be a great next step, and I hope that happens.
Dee says demolition is expected to start in the coming weeks, and he hopes to be open by late summer. Tanya Thorne, KPBS News.
We have a special event coming to KPBS next week that's centered around homelessness. This coming Wednesday, April 20th, Metro reporter Andrew Bowen will host Unsheltered, Solving Homelessness in San Diego. The online forum includes some local experts on the issue, which has no easy fix. Start time is 6 p.m. Again, that's next Wednesday night. You can learn more and sign up to participate at kpbs.org. Asylum seekers stuck in Tijuana barely have a place to call home. Their camp just south of the border crossing was broken up by the city 2 months ago. As they now struggle on the outskirts of town, KPBS border reporter Gustavo Solis met with some who shared their experience.
Rosa, who asked me not to use her last name, has been living in a constant state of terror. She and her 2 youngest children fled from their home in the Mexican state of Michoacan last year after members of a drug cartel stole her family's farm and kidnapped her oldest son. Now in Tijuana, Rosa still pays a monthly ransom of $60 a month to keep her son from being tortured.
Vivo aterrorizada día a día con mis hijos que en cualquier momento puedan saber dónde estamos. No soy una delincuente, no.
Rosa says that the cartel knows that she and her children are in Tijuana, and she's terrified at the thought of being found. She's currently living in the outskirts of town, paying $150 a month to share a 1-bedroom apartment with 5 other people. She's waited nearly a year for a chance to request asylum in the U.S. That delay is caused by Title 42, a public health order from the Trump era that limits access to asylum seekers.
Pues es miedo andar aquí en Tijuana en la calle y que esas personas que nos hicieron daño nos encuentren, y pues de ahí en el Chaparral yo me sentía más segura.
Rosa says she felt much safer living at El Chaparral, a makeshift migrant camp near the San Isidro border crossing that was abruptly shut down by Tijuana authorities in February. For months, she lived in this tent community with hundreds of other asylum seekers, mostly from Mexico and Central America. She knew her neighbors, had access to social services, and could even work in nearby stores. Her new apartment is isolated and in a dangerous neighborhood. It takes her an hour to get to downtown Tijuana, where most of the jobs and social services are. Pedro Rios is an advocate with American Friends Service Committee. He says the living conditions in the camp were by no means ideal, but migrants were safer there than they are now.
Conditions for them, for many of them, went from bad to worse.
He says the migrants have been left to fend for themselves in one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico.
You speak to them individually, you find out that they're going through some serious, troubling situations where they don't have housing, they lack access to information, they are much more susceptible to being robbed or being apprehended by the authorities.
Rosa's neighbor is an Honduran woman named Darcy. She is also running from gangs and asked me not to use her last name. Like Rosa, Darcy used to live in El Chaparral.
No tenemos trabajo. Hemos ido a buscar a fábricas, pero igual no aceptan extranjeros. Y pues nos toca vivir de la línea.
Darcy says there's no work in this part of Tijuana. She's applied for jobs at several maquiladoras, but they don't hire foreigners. She lives off whatever money she can make, begging and washing cars at the long border wait lines. Running out of options, Darcy is left waiting for U.S. border policy to change.
Estamos esperando siempre. Siempre estamos con la ilusión de que nos van a decir, ya necesitamos tal cosa para poder cruzar o qué sé yo, o alguna fecha, alguna esperanza, pues. Siempre vivimos con la idea de que nos van a dar una respuesta.
Rosa and Darcy's frustrations have heightened over the last couple of weeks. The same border officials who used Title 42 to block their asylum in the U.S. have allowed hundreds of Ukrainian war refugees to enter the country. Rosa understands that the Ukrainians are fleeing a war, but she says that living in Michoacán is almost like living in a war zone.
Me pregunto yo y le pregunto al gobierno, ¿que Michoacán no está en guerra? ¿O me van a decir que todo está bien?
The U.S. Department of State currently has a level 4 travel advisory for Michoacán. It is the highest level and advises people to not travel there because of crime and kidnapping risks, the same thing that Rosa is fleeing from. After a year of waiting and living in constant fear, Rosa feels abandoned by both the American and Mexican governments.
Ya un año y viviendo con este temor aquí en nuestro país y no darnos una respuesta es muy difícil y la verdad sí me siento olvidada por las autoridades.
Gustavo Solis, KPBS News.
Here are some of the most read stories this week at kpbs.org. A legal setback for the county fair as a judge weighs in on a contract for ride operators. The city of San Diego is removing an advisory bike lane in Mira Mesa after pushback from the neighborhood. And inside Shanti's house, see the unique place that's providing care for dozens of stray cats. We're continuing our series, Let's Talk About It, where we answer your questions about race and equity. In Part 2, KPBS race and equity reporter Christina Kim takes a look at the art of difficult conversations.
When you first meet Seche Kwamunana, you might notice her big smile or her unique, one-of-a-kind clothing that she designs herself.
See, I like to integrate cultures. My outfit here this is the African country girl.
An immigrant from Cameroon, she calls herself a bridge maker between cultures and ideas.
I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner and a facilitator for the National Conflict Resolution Center.
For her, this work isn't a 9-to-5 job. It's how she lives her life. Almost 2 years ago, at the height of the 2020 racial justice protests, Kwamunana was living in Santee.
In the corner of Mission Gorge and Cuyamaca Street, which is where the bulk of the protests were happening, and then on the other side of the streets were counter-protesters.
The air was thick with tension.
I could not imagine how can anybody be counter-protesting this. You know, it doesn't make sense to me.
So she walked over to them to try to understand. It didn't go particularly well. One man approached her and told her,
"Oh, I can't breathe," which I found very offensive because we're on the other side holding signs that said, "I can't breathe."
She walked away, gathered herself, but then kept coming back, listening and also explaining her experiences as a Black woman. All this to say, Kwamunana knows how to have a tough conversation, which is what makes her the perfect person to answer this week's audience question. It comes from 36-year-old La Mesa storekeeper and artist Alon Nakash. He's a first-generation Iraqi-American who says he's noticed it's hard to talk to people with different political views because people tend to shut down. He asks,
how can we have a conversation and not let it get to someplace extreme? And how do we keep someone's focus?
Drawing from her experiences, Kwamunana has 3 tips for Nakash and others looking to have tough conversations. First,
go into these conversations not with an intention to destroy, but an intention to engage. If you're going with the aim of, I want to destroy, you shut down very fast.
Secondly,
get comfortable being uncomfortable. Expect discomfort and see it as okay, in fact, necessary. We cannot grow without discomfort.
And finally,
get into a conversation not to prove that you're right, but to sharpen your understanding of the issues. We come to conflict when our narrow experiences lead us to different conclusions about how the world really is.
But she says it's important to remember that engaging in conversations isn't always possible when the other person is unwilling to hear you. Mutual respect and dignity are key, she says, because tough conversations are not about giving equal credence to people who spew hate or racism.
Self-care is choosing not to engage with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That's kind of my motto.
And yet, in spite of the setbacks, she still believes in the power of taking time to talk to people about what they believe in. For her, it's not about fixing all the world's divisions through some magical kumbaya moment.
It should not remain in conversations, right? We need them to move into actual actions. And not every conversation will lead to an action tomorrow, but I see them as sowing seeds.
It's about taking the first step towards a more just and understanding world. Cristina Kim, KPBS News.
We want to answer your questions. You can call the number on your screen, 619-630-8516. Leave us a message with your question. We have a couple of stories this week on the important work in arts and sciences happening at SDSU. First, are we alone? KPBS SciTech reporter Thomas Fudge visited a lab on campus, working to figure out what, if anything, used to call Mars home.
Samples to move faster.
PhD student Jessica Torres in a chemistry lab at San Diego State shows me a tiny glass tube she uses to sort through molecules. She can tell by their movement what kind they are and whether they are biological. Ultimately, she hopes to see those signs of life in material gathered from Mars. And where might you find those life signs on the surface of Mars, where there's no water, punishing solar rays, and a high salt content?
It's going to be a very harsh environment. So if there was life to be detected on Mars, it likely would be in porous rocks or on the underside of rocks, somewhere that's kind of shielded from like the harsh environment that is Mars.
The work in this lab could ultimately prove that there is life or was life on at least one other planet in the universe. That's something that we have imagined, it's something we've assumed, but it's never been proven. Analytical chemistry professor Chris Harrison manages the lab, and he's Torres's advisor.
We're looking at the building block molecules that make life function, so specifically amino acids. And these are like little Lego blocks that you assemble them in the right sequence and you get different proteins or enzymes and the functional components of cells.
The glass tube they use to try to sort out the life-building molecules has a channel more narrow than a human hair. Molecules pass through it at different speeds, depending on their size and their electric charge, and that race through the tube can determine whether you are looking at, say, an amino acid. NASA has been successfully landing on Mars since the 1970s, and the first images from the planet showed a perfectly barren landscape. But eventually they did find evidence of old riverbeds likely formed by past water flows. We also have learned that Mars has a thin atmosphere, shown by this drone landing on the planet. Today, the Mars rover Perseverance is up there. It's parked on one of those dried-up river deltas, hoping to collect sedimentary rocks that show signs of life. Michael Meyer is NASA's lead scientist for the Mars Exploration Program. He says if we find proof that life once existed on Mars, that could change our conception of life in the universe.
What is life? What do we know? All we know is us, right? We have one example. As any scientist, one example is not enough to constitute a way to understand the totality of what life is.
Finding proof of life on Mars could demonstrate that there's nothing unique about life on Earth, that in fact the creation of life is just a natural part of a planet's physical and chemical evolution.
As an example, if you have volcanoes and you have water and you have these elements, given enough time, life will start. It could be that easy. We don't know.
The human relationship with the Martians we imagine dates back to the 19th century. That's when H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds. Science fiction author and NASA consultant David Brin says Mars is one of the logical places to look for life.
I think that if we find life elsewhere, it'll be basically a pretty cool thing. And the number one candidate is not Mars right at this moment, or even the clouds of Venus, which really recently were topics, but the 10 ice-roofed water worlds we know we have in the solar system now.
He's talking about, for example, Saturn's moon Titan and Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, moons that are known to have or believed to have liquid oceans.
Let's say we find that life did evolve on its own elsewhere. Well, that suggests that life is everywhere in the cosmos, just bloody everywhere. And that's what I believe to be the case.
Astronomy has also identified 5,000 planets that exist in other solar systems, so the possibilities are great. But for now, we're just looking at what may exist on our next-door planetary neighbor, Mars. Thomas Fudge, KPBS News.
This month marks 27 years since the death of famous Tejano singer Selena. A new generation is learning about her life through a new course at SDSU. KPBS education reporter MG Perez tells us more about her legacy and how it transcends different cultures.
I heard a song on the radio, and I really fell in love with the song, Como la Flor.
Georgette is a drag queen created by this young man, born Jorge Noe Ledesma in a small town just north of Mexico City. Georgette sits at her kitchen table with a powder puff and makeup, preparing to become her alter ego, Selena, the Tejano superstar who died tragically, but helped a confused 10-year-old Mexican boy live and find his true identity.
I had a lot of bullying when I was a kid because of who I am. But I feel great and I love what I do. That's the main thing.
Jorge immigrated to San Diego more than 20 years ago. Signs of Selena are everywhere in his life, including mementos and memories of visiting her gravesite in South Texas. All of it has brought happiness and confidence credited to Selena, her songs, and her spirits.
She didn't speak Spanish so well when she was in the interview, but always you can see that she was giving her best. And this is my first time having an interview in English, and I'm trying to give my best. So we have something in common with that.
The sounds of Selena are now part of a college curriculum. Professor Nathan Shea Rodriguez pitched the idea for a Selena class to the administration of San Diego State pre-pandemic. It is now a permanent elective offered in the spring semester. Dr. Nate, as students call him, is a fan and fellow Texan who grew up with a heavy influence from the Tejano singer. He built the class syllabus with 16 weeks of learning modules that use Selena as a bridge to Latino culture, media representation, and personal identity. There are field trips for students, too.
They get to go out into Barrio Logan, and they get to see the Selena Mercado for Walk the Block. They get to go to Mujeres Brewhouse for the release of the beer. They get to go see drag shows, and they get to conduct an ethnography, write about it, take pictures, videos, sound.
An ethnography is the study of people in their own environment, which includes the LGBTQ community. The next 2 weeks of class are focused on learning that goes boldly down the rainbow road.
Selena is a huge inspiration to the queer community. Tons of drag queens will impersonate her. A lot of queer people, such as myself, find meaning in her music. And so we're going to learn about how we can queer not just Selena's music, but the Latinx culture.
The term pocha is an important vocabulary word featured in class discussions. A pocha is a person caught between two cultures, not completely able to speak Spanish and not completely comfortable in the English-speaking culture. That was Selena. And Karina Bazarte is an SDSU senior who can relate. Karina's Mexican parents thought they helped her by taking her from the barrio and enrolling her in schools with mostly white students.
The most predominantly white schools, and I couldn't find myself. So I'm like, am I like the only one that looks different? Am I the only one that doesn't have blonde hair or blue eyes? So like Selena actually helped me identify who I am now.
Natalia Martinez was only 3 weeks old when Selena was killed.
I never really got to have her present, but I had her music, and I think that's where I was able to create Selena in my head, in the sense of, wow, this is like someone who I want to have as my role model.
Which brings us back to Georgette and the little boy from a little Mexican town who used to dance around his living room, imagining what he could become someday, listening to the music of Selena.
I think the thing that I learned from her is to be always respectful, kind, and sweet. That's how I remember her, and that's how I do every time I'm on stage.
That is a legacy set to music that will never die. MG Perez, KPBS News.
A reminder, you can watch these stories and all of our content on the KPBS YouTube page. We also live stream KPBS Evening Edition weeknights at 5 p.m. We hope you enjoy this look at KPBS News this week. I'm Amitha Sharma. Thank you for joining us.